snake on the side of the road. That snake on the side of the road is not a metaphor for a large military conquest. It's not horses would be the cavalry, and maybe lions would be the military strength. Shimshon is unique. He's at the end of the period of the judges, the last of the judges who's involved in any military conflicts, and it's partially because he's so successful in going up against the Philistines in a manner that draws their reaction not against Israel, but against him. He functions, he operates in a way that is, let's call it out of the box, and not seen as representing the nation. So that when they get attacked by him, it generates a fervor and we got to go get him. It's not we need to retaliate against the country. He manages to successfully channel all of their responses to him, which for a good part of his life, he manages to deflect until the end. He's no longer successful. But that's like the snake, operating in a unique manner, jumps out of its hole, does its attack, disappears again. You want to fight the snake, you're not going to go burn down the forest, you're going to go try to find the snake. You're not going to go shooting all the animals, you're going to go try to find the snake. So he operates in a really unique manner, and quite successfully, enough so that when he dies, the text describes that we're 20 years, the way many understand the text, 20 years where the Philistines refused to consider going to war against Israel because they've been so much of a setback during their experience with Shimshon. We don't want to deal with that world anymore. And 20 years later, that changes. We find King David, famous David and Goliath. Goliath is representing the Philistine military, but that's at least 20 years post Samson. And Yaakov, is perceiving that in the future of Dan. He's perceiving this unique personage that's going to stand up. In his last comment, verse 18, I look forward, I long for your salvation, reflecting the fact that Samson, after he's been captured, prays to God for one more dose of that strength and that capacity to do in all those Philistines who are celebrating his capture. And even though this causes his own death, but to radically stun them by killing so many thousands in that one shot. And God does grant that to him at that juncture. But we commented that this is all comparing him in some way to King David. This is a really unique situation, very different than anything we would attribute to standard monarchy and standard military conquest and strat, or even defensive tactics. Where is King David alluded to in the parsha? That's back in Judah. You go back a few pages to Judah's blessing future, verses 8, 9, 10. So in verse 10, Jacob describes that the staff, the scepter, will not leave Judah. Lo yasru shevet mi Yehuda, u'machokek mi bein raglav, that there'll always be the scepter in the tribe of Judah. And this is understood to be the source that once the monarchy is in Judean hands, which starts with King David, it is not to leave Judean hands. So much as initially the monarchy of Saul and very temporarily maybe his son, but then King David, and at that point and on, monarchy is to be in the hands of David and will eventually be, there's a reference in this verse to until Shiloh arrives, and Shiloh is understood to be a way of referring to Mashiach. And some take the word Shiloh as Shiloh. Shai is the Hebrew word for a gift. The one that will be the magnet for gifts coming his way. The whole world will acknowledge and bring tributes to Israel in the days of Mashiach. He has to be a descendant of David, being a descendant of Judah. Nachmanides on this verse tells us something that is stunning at first. This charge of Jacob, of Yaakov, that monarchy is to be in the hands of Yehuda, he says is the reason for a line in the Gemara about the disappearance of the Hashmona'i family. Know anybody out there who claims to be a descendant of the Maccabees? We have a lot of people claiming to be descendants of a lot of great personalities in Israel. And you'd think the Maccabees would be an easy one to be able to preserve, because people who are Kohen tend to really keep track of the fact that they are Kohen, because it has practical ramifications. And you'd expect some Kohanim out there to say, oh yeah, we're Kohanim, and we go back to the Maccabees, which wouldn't be so strange, given that that's much later in our history. It's not going back to the starting point. And there are lots and lots of people out there who will tell you that they're descendants of King David, which is much, much earlier. And nobody who'll tell you that they're a descendant of the Maccabees. And the Gemara says that Herod, Hordus, if you take the Gemara literally, annihilated the family, sans one young woman. There was one young woman left. It was a princess of the Hashmona'i family. And she stood on a rooftop when she recognized that Herod had his plans to take her and add her to his harem. She stood on the rooftop and said, if anybody declares that they're from the house of the Hashmonaim, know that they are a slave. They're not a legitimate Jew, because there are none left. And she jumped off the roof and killed herself. Now, not all commentaries understand the Talmud to be literal. Some understand that it doesn't mean he annihilated every single member of the family, but he did enough damage to the family that there was no significant power left in the Hashmonai family, and anybody who was left went into hiding and masked their identity so as not to be a target of Herod's rebellion. And then the chain was lost. The information was lost, and nobody today can know that they're from that family. But stunning. A family of such heroes destroyed to that degree, says Nachmanides on this verse, because they violated this verse. The Maccabees, after the success, took the throne and maintained the throne for several generations until Herod rebelled. And what they were supposed to do is turn the throne over to a descendant of Judah, descendant of King David, because of this verse. They didn't do so, and therefore they're in defiance of this verse, and therefore they suffer this incredible, tragic outcome. But the question is raised, okay, that explains the history and this verse and this conflict, but what level of violation is fighting this verse? I mean, there are Torah violations which bear a death penalty. Is this verse one of them? And is this verse even a Torah prohibition? Who said the scepter shall not leave Judah? Is this God or is this Yaakov? Is this, and God said to Jacob saying, or is this Yaakov on his own as a father saying? Now, he's not just a father, right? This is Yaakov, who is the end of the period of forefathers. He is of the greatest prophets who ever lived on the planet. He is seen as the ultimate of the forefathers, and in the eyes of this more mystical works, probably the ultimate human being in many ways. But he's a human being. It's not God. So how can they be so guilty for violating something that it's not? And God said that if anybody defies this, they are to be stoned. There's no death penalty here. Why the severity? So Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky shares a powerful thought that anybody was on when we did Hanukkah class a few weeks ago. Well, I guess about a month ago. We talked then about the fact that part of what the Maccabees represented was the fact that unlike you Greeks, who separate the spiritual from the physical, and the gods from the humans, there's a detachment. We talk about an interface and a connectivity, and everything that touches upon that idea, the Greeks banned. Circumcision. We're taking a physical body with a physical act and indicating the bond with the spiritual. The declaration of Rosh Chodesh, the human court is declaring the calendar, and God's going to respond to that as to when he gives us blessing, when he makes Yom Kippur, when he's going to give us atonement, based on our declaration, not based on the reality of astronomy. And each different aspect of the bans of the Greeks against the Jews related to these areas where we talk about the union between man and God. So much so, that Hanukkah becomes the holiday where we focus on rabbinic law, that the rabbis made a mitzvah to light the candles, and we thank God for that mitzvah. Because if the rabbis made a mitzvah, it's part of God's package. And we say, blessed are you, our Lord God, who sanctified us through this mitzvah that the rabbis created. Hanukkah is all about that, and refer back to the Hanukkah class for more discussion of that. So the Maccabees are restoring this aspect, and that Judaism is dependent on this aspect, and Hanukkah reflects on this aspect. For them to fail to regard Yaakov's commandment, Yaakov's charge for the future, for them to fail in this regard is, again, we always, when somebody's on a greater spiritual height, they are held to a greater standard, but particularly when it's you were the one that was particularly successful in this regard. This is something that you have internalized, and you have, in a sense, eternalized, because you made this message something that can forever be celebrated, and you've secured this for Israel. Failing to preserve that for you is a much greater slight. It may seem unfair because, hey, like, they were so good, so like, let them have a break. No room for mediocrity. In a true Jewish perspective, if you have capacity for greatness, you're expected to be great. And if you have capacity for greatness in a particular realm, as you have displayed, then you're expected to remain great in that particular realm. And their failure in that very realm is therefore held to a much more demanding standard, and hence that rather tragic outcome, whether annihilation or rather significant elimination of all of their power and reduction of their numbers. And that can help us understand Ramban's comment over here, that this breach of not restoring the monarchy to Judah is seen as such an offense, because for that particular group, it's not because they were people who are shallow and we can't hold them to do too much, so who needs them? It's the opposite. They are held to such a high standard because they had such a capacity, because they recognized this particular issue and they were excellent in this regard. Then their later failure in that regard is of such a tragic outcome. So I'll be a little bit about those two. Again, within the 12, there's so much to see, but those two, and again, it glimpses into how Yaakov is giving an understanding of who you are as a tribe, what your nature is as a tribe, what your future is going to be, and sometimes even some of the real future personalities of your tribe are hinted to in that. And we'll leave the others for homework. Have hopefully a few more hours, get some more opportunities to Torah study for 2020. But that'll be the last one of our get-togethers in this venue. And a pleasant, healthy Shabbos, and a good week ahead.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Preis.
All the best. Riel, how are you feeling?
I'm feeling much better, thank God. I'm
all behind you?
Yep.